Did the head of your Aja have a hand in choosing Andaya for the hall? More than usual, I mean? She did, Yukiri replied carefully. Everyone had been sure Andaya would go into the hall one day, perhaps in another 40 or 50 years. Yet Sarancha had all but anointed her when the customary method was discussion until a consensus could be reached on 2 or 3 candidates, then a secret ballot. That was Aja business, though, as secret as Sarancha's name and title. I knew it. Siane nodded excitedly, not at all her normal manner. Saring says that Jewelaine was hand-picked for the Brown, too, apparently not their usual way, and Doacine says the same about Swana, though she was hesitant about saying anything. I think Swana may be head of the Yellow herself. In any case, she was a sitter for 40 years the first time, and you know it isn't common to take a chair after you were a sitter that long. And Farana stepped down for the White less than 10 years ago. No one has ever entered the hall again so soon. To cap it off, Talene says the Greens nominate choices and their Captain General chooses one, but Annalorna chose Rena without any nominations. Yukiri managed to stifle a grimace, but only by a hair. Everyone had their suspicions about who headed other Ajas, else no one would ever have noticed the meetings in the first place. Yet speaking those names aloud was rude at best. Anyone but a sitter might face penance for it. Of course, she and Siane both knew when it came to Adalorna. In her attempts to curry favor, Talene poured out all the secrets of the Green without being asked. It embarrassed all of them except Talene herself. At least it explained why the Greens had been in such an outstanding rage when Adalorna was birched. Still, Captain General was a ridiculous title, Battle Aja or no Battle Aja. At least, head clerk really described what Sarancha did, in a manner of speaking. Down the corridor, Maidani and her warder were standing just in sight on the curve, apparently talking quietly. One or the other always watched further down around the curve, though. In the opposite direction, Bernila was just in sight, too. Her head was swiveling constantly as she tried to watch Yukiri and Siane while keeping an eye out for anyone approaching. The way she kept shifting from one foot to the other would attract attention, too. But these days, a sister alone outside her Aja quarter was asking for trouble, and she knew it. This conversation had to end soon. Yukiri raised one finger. 5 Ajas had to choose new sitters after women they had in the hall joined the rebels. Siane nodded, and Yukiri raised a second finger. Each of those Ajas chose a woman as sitter who wasn't the logical choice. Siane nodded again. A third finger joined the first 2. The Brown had to choose 2 new sitters, but you didn't mention Siobhan. Is there anything, Yukiri smiled wryly, odd about her? No. According to Saren, Siobhan would likely have been her replacement when she decided to step down, but Siane, if you're actually implying the Aja heads conspired over who would go into the hall, and I never heard of her crack-brained notion, if that's what you're suggesting, why would they choose 5 odd women and one who isn't? Yes, I am suggesting it. With the rest of you keeping me practically under lock and key, I have more time for thinking than I know what to do with. Jewelaine and Rena and Andaya gave me a hint, and Farana made me decide to check. What did Siane mean about Andaya and the other 2 giving a hint? Oh, of course. Rena and Andaya were not really old enough to be in the hall. The custom of not talking about age soon enough became the habit of not thinking about it either. 2 might have been coincidence, Siane went on. Even 3 were that strains credulity, but 5 makes a pattern. Except for the Blue, the Brown was the only Aja to have 2 sitters join the rebels. Maybe there's a reason in that why they chose one odd sister and one not, if I can figure it out. But there is a pattern, a puzzle. And whether it's rational or not, something tells me we had better solve it before the rebels get here. It makes me feel as though somebody's hand is on my shoulder, but when I look, there isn't anyone there. What strained credulity was the idea of the Aja heads conspiring in the first place. But then, Yukiri thought, a conspiracy of sitters is beyond far-fetched, and I'm in the middle of one. And there was the simple fact that no one outside an Aja was supposed to know the Aja's head. but the Aja heads against all custom did. If there's a puzzle, she said wearily, you have a long time to solve. The rebels can't leave Murin before spring, whatever they've told people, and the march upriver will take months if they hold their army together that long. She did not doubt they would, though. Not any longer. Go back to your rooms before someone sees us standing here warded and think on your puzzle, she said, not unkindly, resting a hand on Siane's sleeve. You'll have to put up with being looked after until we're all sure you are safe. The expression on Siane's face would have been called sullen on anyone but a sitter. I'll speak to Saren again, she said, but the light of Saidar around her vanished. Watching her join Bernila and the two of them glide up the curving hallway toward the Aja quarters, both as wary as fawns when wolves were out, Yukiri felt a heavy heart. It was a pity the rebels could not get there before summer. At least that might make the Ajas come together again, so sisters were not forced to slink about the White Tower. As well wish for wings, she thought sadly. Determined to keep her mood in check, she went to gather up Maidani and Leonin. She had a black sister to investigate, and at least investigation was a puzzle she knew how to work.
Gowan's eyes popped open in the darkness as a new wave of cold rose into the hayloft. The barn's thick stone walls normally kept out the worst of the night's chill, if only the worst. Voices murmured below. No one sounded excited. He took his hand away from the sword lying beside him and tugged his gauntlets tighter. Like all the rest of the younglings, he slept in every stitch he could put on. Probably it was just time to wake some of the men around him for their sentry turns. But he was fully awake now himself, and he doubted he would find sleep again soon. In any case, his sleep was always fretful, troubled by dark dreams, haunted by the woman he loved. He did not know where Egwene was, or whether she was alive, or whether she could forgive him. He stood up, letting the loose hay he had pulled over himself slide off his cloak, and buckled on his sword belt. As he picked his way among the shadowy mounds of men sleeping in stacked bales of hay, the faint scrape of boots on wooden rungs told him someone was climbing a ladder to the loft. A dim figure appeared at the top of the ladder, then stopped to wait for him. "Lord Gowan," Roger's deep voice said softly, in a demonic accent, unaltered by 6 years' training in Tarvalin. The first lieutenant's rumbling voice was always a surprise, coming from a slight man who stood barely higher than Gowan's shoulder. Even so, had times been different, Roger surely would have been a warder by this time. "I thought I'd have to wake you. A sister arrived on foot. A messenger from the tower. She wanted the sister in charge here. I told Tommel and his brother to take her to the mayor's house before they turned in for the night." Gowan sighed. He should have gone home when he returned to Tarvalin and found the younglings expelled from the city, instead of letting himself be caught here by winter, especially when he was sure Elida wanted them all dead. His sister Elaine came in eventually, if she was not already there. Certainly any Aes Sedai would see that the daughter heir of Andor reached Caemlyn in time to claim the throne before someone else could. The White Tower would not give up the advantage of a queen who would also be Aes Sedai. On the other hand, Elaine could be on her way to Tarvalin too, or residing in the White Tower right that minute. He did not know how she had become entangled with Swan Sanche, or how deeply. She always dove into a pond without checking the depth. But Elida and the hall of the tower might want to question her closely, daughter heir or not, queen or not. He was sure she could not be held accountable, though. She was still only one of the accepted. He had to tell himself that frequently. The newest problem was that an army lay between him and Tarvalin now. At least 25,000 soldiers on this side of the river Aranin, and, he had to believe, as many on the west bank. They had to be supporting the Aes Sedai, whom Elida called rebels. Who else would dare besiege Tarvalin itself? The way that army had appeared, though, seeming to materialize out of nowhere in the middle of a snowstorm, was enough to raise prickles on his back still. Rumor and alarms always flew ahead of any large force under arms on the march. Always. This one had arrived like spirits, in silence. The army was as real as stone, however, so he could neither enter Tarvalin to find whether Elaine was in the tower, nor ride south. Any army would take notice of upward of 300 men on the move, and the rebels would have no goodwill toward the younglings. Even if he went alone, travel in winter was very slow, and he could reach Caemlyn as quickly if he waited until spring. There was no hope of finding passage on a ship, either. The siege would mire river traffic in a hopeless snarl. He was mired in a hopeless snarl. And now an Aes Sedai had come in the middle of the night. She would not simplify matters any. "Let's find out what news she brought," he said quietly, motioning Roger down the ladder ahead of him. 20 horses and their stacked saddles crowded nearly every inch of the dark barn not taken by Mistress Millen's 24 or so milk cows in their stalls, so he and Roger had to thread their way to the wide doors. The only warmth came from the sleeping animals. The 2 men guarding the horses were silent shadows, but Gawain could feel them watching Roger and him slip out into the icy night. They would know about the messenger and be wondering. The sky was clear, and the waning moon still gave a fair light. The village of Dorlan shone with snow. Holding their cloaks close, the pair of them trudged knee-deep through the village in silence, along what had once been the road to Tarvalin from a city that had not existed for hundreds of years. Nowadays, nobody traveled in this direction from Tarvalin, except to come to Dorlan, and there was no reason to come in winter. By tradition, the village supplied cheeses to the White Tower, and to no one else. It was a tiny place, just 15 slate-roofed, gray stone houses with drifts of snow piled up as high as the bottom of the windows. A little distance behind each house stood its cow barn, all crowded with men and horses now, as well as cows. Most of Tarvalin might well have forgotten Dorlan existed. Who thought about where cheese came from? It had seemed a very good place for keeping out of sight. Until now. All the houses but one in the village were dark. Light leaked through the shutters on several windows of Master Burlow's dwelling, upstairs and down. Garin Burlow had the misfortune to own the largest house in Dorlan, in addition to being mayor. Villagers who had shifted sleeping arrangements to find a bed for an Aes Sedai must be regretting it by now. Master Burlow had had 2 rooms already empty. Stamping the snow from his boots on the stone step, Gawain rapped at the mayor's stout door with a gauntleted fist. No one answered, and after a moment he lifted the latch and led Roger in. The beam-ceilinged front room was fairly large for a farmhouse, dominated by several tall open-front cabinets, full of pewter and glazed crockery, and a long polished table lined with high-backed chairs. All of the oil lamps had been lit, an extravagance in winter, when a few tallow candles would do, but the flames in the fireplace had made little impression on the split logs yet, or on the temperature of the room. Even so, the 2 sisters who had rooms above were barefoot on the rugless wooden floor, with fur-lined cloaks flung hastily over their linen nightdresses. Catherine Arudin and Tarna Feir were watching a small woman in a dark yellow-slashed riding dress and cloak that were snow-damp to her hips. She stood as near the wide hearth as she could, tiredly warming her hands and shivering. A foot in the snow, she could not have made the trip from Tarvalin in less than 2 or 3 days, and even Aes Sedai felt the cold eventually. She had to be the sister Roger had spoken of, yet compared to the others, the agelessness was hardly noticeable in her. Compared to the other 2, she was hardly noticeable at all. The absence of the mayor and his wife put an extra knot in Gawain's middle, though he had half expected it. They would have been there making over the Aes Sedai, offering hot drinks and food, no matter the hour, unless they had been sent back to their bed to give Katarine and Tarna privacy with the messenger, which likely meant he was a fool to want to know the message, but he had known that before he left the barn. "Boatman said he would stay where we landed until the siege lifted," the small woman was saying in weary tones as Gawain entered. "But he was so frightened, he could be leagues downriver by now." As the cold from the doorway reached her, she looked around, and some of the fatigue drained from her square face. "Gawain Trakand," she said. "I have orders for you from the Amarland seat, Lord Gawain." "Orders?" Gawain said, drawing off his gauntlets and tucking them behind his belt to gain time. Blunt truth might be in order for once, he decided. "Why would Elida send me orders? Why should I obey if she did? She disowned me and the younglings." Roger had taken a respectful stance for the sisters, hands folded behind his back, and he gave Gawain a quick sidelong glance. He would not speak out of turn, whatever Gawain said, but the younglings did not share Gawain's belief. Aes Sedai did what they did, and no man could know why until his sister told him. The younglings had cast their lots with the White Tower wholeheartedly, embracing fate. "That can wait, Narinwin," Katarine snapped, jerking her cloak tighter. Her black hair spilled around her shoulders, half in tangles, as though she had taken a few hasty swipes with a comb and given up. There was an intensity about her that reminded Gawain of a hunting lynx, or maybe one wary of traps. She spared half a glance for him and Roger, no more. I have pressing business in the tower. Tell me how to find this nameless fishing village. Whether or not your boatman is still there, I'll find someone to take me across. And me, Tarna put in, her strong jaw stubborn and her blue eyes sharp as spears. In contrast to Katarine, Tarna's long pale yellow hair was as neat as if she had had a maid attending her before coming downstairs. She was every bit as focused, though, just more controlled. I also have urgent reason to reach the tower without any further delay. She gave Gawain a nod, and Roger a lesser, cool as the marble she seemed carved from, yet more friendly than the face she showed Katarine, or got in return. There was always a stiffness between the two women, though they shared the same Ajah. They did not like one another, perhaps even disliked each other. With Aes Sedai, it was hard to be sure. Gawain would not be sorry to see either leave. Tarna had ridden into Dorlan barely a day after the mysterious army arrived, and however Aes Sedai determined these things, she immediately displaced Lasonia Cole from her room upstairs, and Kavarla Baldine from command of the 11 other sisters already in the village. She might have been a green from the way she took charge of everything, questioning the other sisters about the situation, inspecting the younglings closely every day as though searching for possible warders. Having a red study them that way made the men start looking over their shoulders. Worse, Tarna spent long hours out riding, no matter the weather, trying to find some local who could show her a way into the city past the besiegers. Sooner or later, she would lead their scouts back to Dorlan. Katarine had come only yesterday, in a fury at having her path to Tarvalon blocked, and straightway took command from Tarna and her room from Kavarla. Not that she used her authority in the same way. She avoided the other sisters, refusing to tell anyone why she had disappeared at Demise Wells, or where she had been. But she, too, had inspected the younglings, with the air of a woman examining an axe she had a mind to use, and not a care how much blood was shed. He would not have been surprised if she had tried to bully him into cutting away to the bridges into the city for her. He would be more than happy to see them go, in fact. But then, when they left, he would have to deal with Narenwin, and with Elida's orders. It's hardly a village, Katarine, the shivering sister said. Just 3 or 4 squalid little fishermen's houses a full day downriver by land. More than that from here. Plucking at her damp skirts, she held them nearer the fire. We may be able to find a way to send messages into the city, but you two are needed here. All that stopped Elida sending 50 sisters or more, rather than just one, was the difficulty of getting even one tiny boat across the river unseen, even in darkness. I must say I was surprised to learn there were any sisters this close to Tarvalon. Under the circumstances, every sister who is outside the city must... Tarna cut her off firmly with a raised hand. Elida cannot even know I am here. Katarine closed her mouth and frowned, her chin lifting, but she let the other red continue. What were her orders to you regarding the sisters in Dorlan, Narenwin? Roger took to studying the floorboards in front of his boots. He had faced battle without flinching, yet only a fool wanted to be around Aes Sedai who were arguing. The short woman fussed with her divided skirts a moment longer. I was ordered to take charge of the sisters I found here, she said stuffily, and do what I could. After a moment, she sighed and amended herself reluctantly. The sisters I found here under Kavarla. But surely... This time Katarine broke in. I was never under Kavarla, Narenwin, so those orders cannot apply to me. In the morning, I will set out to find these 3 or 4 fishermen's huts. But enough, Narenwin, Katarine said in an icy voice. You can make your arrangements with Kavarla. The black-haired woman gave her Ajah sister a glance from the corner of her eye. I suppose you may accompany me, Tarna. A fishing boat should have room for 2. Tarna bent her head the slightest fraction, possibly in thanks. Their business concluded, the pair of Reds gathered their cloaks around them and glided toward the door, deeper into the house. Narenwin shot a vexed look at their backs and turned her attention to Gawain, her face settling into the semblance of a calm mask. Have you any word of my sister? He asked before she could open her mouth. Do you know where she is? The woman really was tired. She blinked, and he could almost see her forming an answer that would tell him nothing. Stopping halfway to the door, Tarna said, Elaine was with the rebels when I saw her last. Every head jerked toward her. But your sister is safe from retribution, she went on calmly, so put that out of your mind. Accepted can't choose which sisters to obey. I give you my word, under the law she can suffer no lasting harm of it. She seemed unaware of Katarine's frozen stare, or Narenwin's popping eyes. You could have told me before this, Gawain said roughly. No one spoke roughly to Aes Sedai, not more than once, but he was past caring. Were the other two surprised that Tarna knew the answer, or surprised that she had given it? What do you mean by no lasting harm? The pale-haired sister barked a laugh. I can hardly promise she won't suffer a few welts if she puts her feet too far wrong. Elaine is one of the accepted, not Aes Sedai. Yet that protects her from greater harm if she is led astray by a sister. And you never asked. Besides, she doesn't need rescuing, even if you could manage it. She is with Aes Sedai. Now you know as much as I can tell you of her, and I'm going to find a few hours more sleep before daylight. I will leave you to Narenwin. Katarine watched her go without altering her expression by an eyelash, a woman of ice with the eyes of a hunting cat. But then she herself strode from the room so quickly that her cloak flared behind her. Tarna is correct, Narenwin said once the door closed behind Katarine. The small woman might not make a good show of Aes Sedai serenity and mystery alongside the other two, but alone she managed very well. Elaine is sealed to the White Tower. So are you, for all your talk of disowning. The history of Andor seals you to the tower. The younglings are sealed to the tower by our own choice, Narenwin Sedai, Rajar said, making a leg formally. Narenwin's gaze remained on Gawa. He closed his eyes, and it was all he could do not to scrub at them with the heels of his hands. The younglings were sealed to the White Tower. No one would ever forget that they had fought on the very grounds of the tower to stop the rescue of a deposed Amerlin. For good or ill, the tale would follow them to their graves. He was marked by that as well, and by his own secrets. After all that bloodshed, he was the man who had let Swan Sanche walk free. More importantly, though, Elaine bound him to the White Tower, and so did Egwene Alvir, and he did not know which tied the tighter knot, the love of his sister or the love of his heart. To abandon one was to abandon all three, and while he breathed, he could not abandon Elaine or Egwene. You have my word that I will do all I can, he said wearily. What does Elida want of me? The sky above Camelin was clear, the sun a pale golden ball near its noonday peak. It shed a brilliant light in the blanket of white covering the surrounding countryside, but gave no warmth. Still, the weather was warmer than Davram Bashir would have expected back home in Saldaia, though he did not regret the marten for lining his new cloak. Cold enough in any case for his breath to have frosted his thick mustaches with more white than the years had put in them. Standing in ankle-deep snow among the leafless trees on a rise perhaps a league north of Camelin, he held a long, gold-mounted looking-glass to his eye, studying the activity on lower ground about a mile south of him. Quick nosed his shoulder impatiently from behind, but he ignored the bay. Quick disliked standing still, but sometimes you had to, whatever you wanted. A sprawling camp was going up down there among the scattered trees, astride the road to Tarvalin, soldiers unloading supply wagons, digging latrines, erecting tents, and building lean-tos of brush and tree limbs, scattered in clumps of varying size, each lord and lady keeping their own men close. They expected to be in place for some time. From the horse lines and the general extent of the camp, he estimated close to 5,000 men, give or take a few hundred. Fighting men. Fletchers, farriers, armorers, laundresses, wagon drivers, and other camp followers as good as doubled that, though as usual they were making their own camp on the fringes. Most of the camp followers spent more time staring toward the rise where Bashir stood than they did working. Here and there a soldier paused in his labors to peer toward the higher ground too, but bannermen and squadmen quickly drove them back to their work. The nobles and officers riding about the rising camp never so much as glanced north, that Bashir saw. A fold of land hid them from the city, though he could see the silver-streaked gray walls from his rise. The city knew they were there, of course. They had announced themselves that morning with trumpets and banners in sight of the walls. Well out of bowshot, though. Laying siege to a city with high, strong walls that stretched more than 6 leagues in circumference was no easy matter, and complicated in this instance by Low Camelin, the warren of brick and stone houses and shops, windowless warehouses, and long markets that lay outside Camelin's walls. 7 more like camps were being made, though, spaced around the city where they could cover every road, every gate that would allow a sizable sortie. They already had patrols out, and likely watchers lurked in the now deserted buildings of Low Camelin. Small parties might get past into the city, maybe a few pack animals by night, but not near enough to feed one of the world's great cities. Hunger and disease ended more sieges than swords or siege engines ever did. The only question was whether they brought down besieged or besieger first. The plan seemingly had all been well thought out by someone, but what confused him were the banners in the camp below. It was a strong-looking glass crafted by a Cariana named Tovir, a gift from Randall Thor, and he could make out most of the banners whenever a breeze straightened them. He knew enough of Andron's sigils to pick out the oaken axe of Dolan Armathan, and the 5 silver stars of Dairilla Rhaenyd, and several more banners of lesser nobles who supported Nean Aran's claim to the Lion Throne and Rose Crown of Andor. Yet Jylan Moran's cross-hatched red wall was down there too, and Carla Sankarin's paired white leopards, and Aram Token's golden winged hand. By all reports, they were oath-sworn to Nean's rival, Elenia Sarand. Seeing them with the others was like seeing wolves and wolfhounds sharing a meal, with a cask of good wine opened in the bargain. 2 other banners, gold-fringed and at least twice the size of any others, were on display as well, though both were too heavy for the occasional gust to make them more than stir. They shone with the glisten of thick silk. He had seen the pair clearly enough earlier, however, when the bannermen rode back and forth atop the rise that hid their camp, the banners spread out above them in the breeze of their gallop. One was the Lion of Andor, wiped on red, the same as flew from the tall round towers dotted along the city wall. In both cases, it was a declaration of someone's right to the throne and crown. The second large banner below him proclaimed the woman throwing her claim against that of Elaine Trakand. 4 silver moons on a field of twilight blue, the sign of House Marn. All this was in support of Aramilla Marn. A month ago, she would have been lucky if anyone except her own house, or that half-witted Nason Cairn, gave her a bed for the night. They ignore us, Vale growled. I could break them before sunset and leave not one alive to see the sunrise again. Yet they ignore us. Bashir looked sideways at the Aielman. Sideways and up. The man towered above him by well over a foot. Only Bale's gray eyes and a strip of sun-dark skin was visible above the black veil drawn across his face. Bashir hoped the man was just shielding his mouth and nose from the cold. He was carrying his short spears and bull-hide buckler, and he had a cased bow at his back and a quiver at his hip, but only the veil mattered. This was no time for the Aiel to start killing. 20 paces down slope toward the camp, 30 more Aielmen were squatting on their heels, holding their weapons casually. 1 in 3 had his face bare, so maybe it was the cold. With Aiel, you could never be sure, though. Quickly considering several approaches, Bashir decided on lightness. Elaine Trakand would not like that, Bale. And if you've forgotten what it's like being a young man, that means Randall Thor won't like it. Bale grunted sourly. Elaine told me what Elaine Trakand said. We must do nothing on her part. This is simple-minded. When an enemy comes against you, you make use of whoever will dance the spears by your side. Do they play at war the way they play at their game of houses? We are Outlanders, Vale. That counts in Andor. The huge Aielman grunted again. There seemed no point trying to explain the politics involved. Outland help could cost Elaine what she was trying to gain, and her enemies knew it, and knew she knew it, so they had no fear of Bashir or Bale, or the Legion of the Dragon, whatever their numbers. In fact, despite the siege, both sides would go to great effort to avoid pitched battle. It was a war, but of maneuver and skirmishes, unless someone blundered, and the winner would be whoever gained an unassailable position or forced the other into one that could not be defended. Bale likely would see it as no different from Deus Daemar. In all truth, Bashir saw a great deal of similarity himself. With the blight on its doorstep, Saldaea could not afford contests for the throne. Tyrants could be endured. The blight soon killed the stupid and the greedy, but even this peculiar sort of civil war would allow the blight to kill Saldaea. He returned to studying the camp through his looking glass, trying to puzzle out how an utter fool like Aramilla Marn could gain the backing of Nean Aran and Elenia Sarand. That pair was greedy and ambitious, each utterly convinced of her own right to the throne, and if he understood the tangled web Andorans used to decide these matters, each had far better claim than Aramilla. Wolves and wolfhounds were not in it. This was wolves deciding to follow a lapdog. Perhaps Elaine knew the reason, but she would barely even exchange notes with him, brief and uninformative. Too much chance someone would learn of it and think she was plotting with him. It was very like the game of houses. Someone is going to dance the spears, it seems, Bale said. Bashir lowered the ornate tube long enough to find where the Aielman was pointing. There had been a steady stream of people fleeing the city ahead of the siege for days, but someone had left it too late. Half a dozen canvas-topped wagons stood halted in the middle of the Tarvalin Road, just outside the edge of Low Camelin, surrounded by 50 horsemen under a blue and white bordered banner that appeared to show a running bear, maybe some sort of thick-bodied hound, when it rippled in the sudden wind. Dispirited folk huddled to one side, clutching cloaks around themselves, and with their heads down, shoving clean to women's skirts. Some of the horsemen had dismounted to ransack the wagons, chests and boxes and even what looked to be clothes already dotted the snow. Likely they were searching for coin or drink, though any other valuable that turned up would go into someone's saddlebags too. Soon enough, someone would free the wagon teams, or perhaps they would just take the wagons. Wagons and horses were always useful for an army, and the peculiar rules of this very peculiar Andorran civil war did not appear to give much protection to those who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the city gates were swinging open, and as soon as the gap was wide enough, red-coated lancers poured out of the 20-foot-high arch at a gallop, sunlight glittering on lance points and breastplates and helmets, thundering down the road between the long, empty markets. The Queen's guards were coming out. Enough of them, anyway. Bashir swung his glass back to the wagons. Apparently, the officer under the bear, if bear it was, had done his sums already. 50 against 200 made very poor odds, with only a few wagons at stake. The men who had dismounted were back in their saddles, and even as Bashir found them, a lot of them galloped away north toward him, the blue and white banner streaming behind its staff. Most of the people huddled beside the road stared after the departing soldiers, their confusion as clear as if he had been able to make out their faces. But a few immediately rushed to begin gathering up their scattered belongings out of the snow and piling them back into the wagons. The arrival of the guardsmen, drawing rein around the wagons a few minutes later, put a quick end to that. Guardsmen quickly began herding people toward the wagons. Some still tried to dart past them for some prized belonging, and one man began waving his arms in protest at a guardsman, an obvious officer with white plumes on his helmet and a red sash across his breastplate. But the officer leaned from the saddle and backhanded the protester in the face. The fellow went down on his back like a stone, and after one frozen moment, everyone who was not already scrambling onto the wagons went scurrying, except a pair of men who paused to pick up the fallen man by his shoulders and heels, and they hurried as best they could, carrying his limp weight. A woman up in the last wagon in line was already lashing her reins to get her team turned around and headed back toward the city. Bashir lowered the glass to study the camp, then pressed it back to his eye for a closer look. Men were still digging away with shovel and mattock, and others wrestling sacks and barrels down from wagons. Nobles and officers walked their horses about the camp, keeping an eye on the work. All calm as cattle in pasture. Finally, someone pointed toward the rise between them and the city, then another and another, and mounted men began to trot, plainly shouting orders. The bear banner was just coming into sight of the camp on the height. Tucking the glass beneath his arm, Bashir frowned. They had no guards on the high ground to warn them of what might be happening beyond their sight. Even in the certainty no one was going to offer battle, that was stupid. It might also be useful if the other camps were as careless, and if no one corrected the mistake. He puffed irritably through his mustaches. If he had been going to fight the besiegers. A glance showed him the wagons halfway back to the Tarvalin gate, with their escort of guardsmen, the wagon drivers lashing their teams as if pursuit were breathing down their necks. Or maybe it was just the officer with the sash who was waving his sword over his head for some reason. "There'll be no dancing today," he said. "Then I have better to do with my day than watch wetlanders dig holes," Bale replied. "May you always find water and shade, Davram Bashir." "At the moment, I'd rather have dry feet and a warm fire," Bashir muttered without thinking, and wished he had not. Step on a man's formality, and he might try to kill you. And the Aiel were formal and strange besides. But Bale threw back his head and laughed. "The wetlands turn everything on its head, Davram Bashir." A curious gesture of his right hand brought the other Aiel to their feet, and they loped off eastward in long, easy strides. The snow did not seem to give them any difficulty. Sliding his looking glass into the leather case hanging from Quick's saddle bow, Bashir mounted and turned the bay west. His own escort had been waiting on the reverse slope, and they fell in behind him with only the faint creak of leather and never a jingle of unsecured metal. They numbered fewer than Bale's escort, but they were tough men from his estates at Tyre, and he had led them into the Blight many times before bringing them south. Every man had his assigned part of the trail to watch, ahead or behind, left or right, high or low, and their heads swiveled constantly. He hoped they were not just going through the motions. The forest was sparse here, every branch bare except an oak and leatherleaf, pine and fir. But the snow-covered land rolled so that 100 mounted men could be 50 paces away and unseen. Not that he expected any such thing, but then, what killed you was always what you never expected. Unconsciously, he eased his sword in its scabbard. You just had to expect the unexpected. Tumad had command of the escort. As he did most days, Bashir did not have something more important for the young lieutenant to do. Bashir was grooming him. He could think clearly and see beyond what was in front of him. He was destined for higher rank if he lived long enough. A tall man, if a couple of hands shorter than Bale, today he wore disgruntlement on his face like a second nose. What troubles you, Tumad? The Ayuman was right, my lord. Tumad tugged angrily at his thick black beard with a gauntleted fist. These Andorans spit at our feet. I do not like having to ride away while they thumb and ear at us. Well, he was still young. You find our situation boring, perhaps? Bashir laughed. You need more excitement? Tenobia is only 50 leagues north of us, and if rumor can be believed, she brought Atheniela of Kandor, and Paitar of Arafel, and even that Shinar and Isar with her. All the might of the borderlands come looking for us, Tumad. Those Andorans down in Murundi don't like us being in Andor either, so I hear. And if that Aes Sedai army they're facing doesn't chop them to pieces, or hasn't already, they may come looking for us. So may the Aes Sedai, for that matter, sooner or later. We've ridden for the Dragon Reborn, and I can't see any sister forgiving that. And then there are the Shongshan, Tumad. Do you really think we've seen the last of them? They will come to us, or we will have to go to them. One or the other is sure. You young men don't know excitement when it's crawling in your mustache. Quiet chuckles rippled through the men following, men as old as Bashir himself for the most part, and even Tumad flashed white teeth through his beard in a grin. They had all been on campaign before, if never one so odd as this. Straightening around, Bashir watched the way through the trees, but with only half his attention. In all truth, Tenobia did worry him. The light only knew why Isar and the others had decided to leave the Black Border together, much less strip away as many soldiers as Hearsay said they had brought south. Even Hearsay divided by half. Doubtless they had reasons they considered good and sufficient, and doubtless Tenobia shared them. But he knew her. He had taught her to ride, watched her grow up, presented her the broken crown when she took the throne. She was a good ruler, neither too heavy-handed nor too light, intelligent if not always wise, brave without being foolhardy, but impulsive was a mild description of her. Sometimes hot-headed was mild. And he was as sure as he could be that she had her own goal, aside from whatever the others aimed at. The head of Davram Bashir. If that was so, she was unlikely to settle for another period of exile after coming this far. The longer Tenobia worried a bone in her teeth, the harder it was to convince her to give it up. It was a neat problem. She should be in Saldeia, guarding the Blight border, but so should he. She could convict him of treason twice over, at least, for what he had done since coming south, but he still could see no other way to a bone. Rebellion, Tenobia could define that loosely when she chose. Rebellion was horrible to contemplate, yet he wondered his head firmly attached to his neck a while longer. A neat and thorny problem. The encampment containing the 8,000-odd light cavalry he had left after Ilion in fighting the Shongshan spread wider than the camp back on the Tarvalin Road, but it could not be said to sprawl. The horse lines were uniform rows, with a farrier's forge at either end, stretched between equally straight rows of large gray or shell-white tents, though those showed a good many patches now. Every man could be mounted and ready to fight inside a count of 50 from a trumpet signal, and his sentries were placed to make sure they had that count and more. Even the camp followers' tents and wagons, 100 paces south of the rest, were more orderly than the soldiers besieging the city, as though they had followed the example of the Saldeans. Somewhat, at least. As he rode in with his escort, men moved quickly and grimly among the horse lines, almost as if the signal to mount had been sounded. More than one had his sword drawn. Voices called to him, but at the sight of a large crowd of men and women, mostly women, gathered in the center of the camp, he felt a sudden numbness inside. He dug in his heels, and Quick sprang forward at a gallop. He did not know whether anyone followed him or not. He heard nothing. He heard nothing but the blood pounding in his ears, saw nothing but the crowd in front of his own sharp-peaked tent, the tent he shared with Dira. He did not rein in on reaching the crowd, just threw himself out of the saddle and hit the ground running. He heard people speak without taking in what they were saying. They parted in front of him, opening a path to his tent, or he would have run over them. Just inside the tent flaps, he halted. The tent, large enough for 20 soldiers to sleep in, was crowded to the walls with women, wives of nobles and officers, but his eyes quickly found his own wife, Dira, seated on a folding chair in the middle of the carpets that served for a floor, and the numbness faded. He knew she would die one day. They both would. But the only thing he feared was living without her. Then he realized that some of the women were helping her to lower her dress to her waist. Another was pressing a folded cloth to Dira's left arm, and the cloth was growing red as blood ran down her arm in a sheet and dripped from her fingers into a bowl set on the carpet. There was a considerable amount of dark blood already in the bowl. She saw him at the same instant, and her eyes flashed in a face that was much too pale. "It comes from hiring outlanders, husband," she said fiercely, her right hand shaking a long dagger at him. As tall as most men, inches taller than he, and beautiful, her face framed with raven hair, winged with white, she had a commanding presence that could become imperious when she was angry, even when she obviously could barely sit upright. Most women would have been flustered at being bare to the waist in front of so many, with her husband present. Not Dira. "If you did not always insist on moving like the wind, we could have good men from our own estates to do whatever was needful." "A dispute with servants, Dira," he said, cocking an eyebrow. "I never thought you'd start taking knives to them." Several of the women gave him cool, sidelong glances. Not every man and wife dealt together as he and Dira did. Some thought them odd, since they seldom shouted. Dira scowled at him, then grunted a short, involuntary laugh. "I will start at the beginning, Davram, and go slowly so you can understand," she added with a small smile, pausing to thank the woman who draped a white linen sheet around her bare torso. "I returned from my ride to find two strange men ransacking our tent. They drew daggers, so naturally I hit one of them with a chair and stabbed the other." She directed a grimace at her cut arm. "Not well enough, since he managed to touch me. Then Zavian and some of the others came in, and the pair fled through a slit they had made in the rear of the tent." Several of the women nodded grimly and gripped the hilts of the daggers they all wore, until Dira said darkly, "I told them to give chase, but they insisted on tending my scratch." Hands dropped away from hilts, and faces colored, though none looked in the least apologetic for disobeying. They had been in a ticklish position. Dira was their liege lady as he was their liege lord, but whether or not she called it a scratch, she could have bled to death if they had left her to go chasing the thieves. "In any event," she went on, "I ordered a search. They won't be hard to find. One has a lump on his head and the other is bleeding." She gave a sharp, satisfied nod. Zavian, the sinewy red-haired lady of Gahar, held up a threaded needle. "Unless you have taken up an interest in embroidery, my lord," she said coolly, "may I suggest that you withdraw?" Bashir acquiesced with a small bow of his head. Dira never liked him to watch her being sewn up. He never liked watching her being sewn up. Outside the tent, he paused to announce in a loud voice that his lady wife was well and being tended, and that they should all go on about their business. The men departed with wishes for Dira's well-being, but none of the women stirred a foot. He did not press them. They would remain until Dira herself appeared, whatever he said, and a wise man tried to avoid battles he would not only lose, but look foolish losing. Tumad was waiting on the edge of the crowd, and he fell in beside Bashir, who walked with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He had been expecting this, or something like, for a long time, but he had almost begun to think it would not happen, and he had never expected Dira to nearly die because of it. "The two men have been found, my lord," Tumad said. "At least, they apparently meet the description the Lady Dira gave." Bashir's head jerked around, murder on his face, and the younger man quickly added, "They were dead, my lord, just outside the camp. Each got one thrust with a narrow blade." He stabbed a finger at the base of his skull, just behind the ear. "It had to be more than one did it, unless he was faster than a rock viper." Bashir nodded. The price of failure often was death. Two to search, and how many to silence them? How many remained? And how long before they tried again? Worst of all, who was behind it? The White Tower? The Forsaken? It seemed a decision had been reached for him. No one except Tumad was close enough to hear him, but he spoke softly anyway, and chose his words cautiously. Sometimes the price of carelessness was death, too. You know where to find the man who came to me yesterday. Find him and tell him I agree. But there will be a few more than we talked about.
The light, feathery snow falling on the city of Kyrian dimmed the morning sunlight only a little, just muting the brightness. From the tall, narrow window in the Sun Palace, fitted with a casement of good glass panes against the cold, Samitsu could see clearly the wooden scaffolding erected around the ruined section of the palace, broken cubes of dark stone still littered with rubble, and stepped towers that stopped abruptly short of equaling the rest of the palace's towers. One, the Tower of the Risen Sun, was simply no longer there. Several of the city's fabled topless towers loomed through the drifting white flakes, enormous square spires with huge buttresses, much taller by far than any in the palace, despite its location on the highest hill in a city of hills. They were wrapped in their own scaffolds, and still not completely rebuilt 20 years after the Aiel had burned them. Another 20 might see them done. There were no workmen clambering along the planks on any of the scaffolding, of course, not in this weather. She found herself wishing the snow could give her a respite, too. When Catswain departed a week past, leaving her in charge, her task had appeared straightforward. Make sure the Kyrianan pot did not begin to boil again. That had appeared a simple task at the time, though she had seldom dabbled in politics to speak of. Only one noble retained sizable forces under arms, and Dobrain was cooperative for the most part, seeming to want everything kept quiet. Of course, he had accepted that fool appointment as Steward of Kyrian for the Dragon Reborn. The boy had named a Steward of Tyr, too, a man who had been in rebellion against him a month gone. If he had done as much in Ilion, it seemed all too probable. Those appointments would cause no end of trouble for sisters to sort out before all was said and done. The boy brought nothing but trouble. Yet so far, Dobrain seemed to be using his new post only to run the city, and to quietly rally support for Elaine Trakan's claim to the Sun Throne, if she ever made one. Samitsu was satisfied to leave it at that, not caring one way or another who took the Sun Throne. She did not care much for Kyrian at all. The falling snow beyond her window swirled in a gust of wind like a white kaleidoscope, so tranquil. Had she ever valued tranquility before? She certainly could not recall it if she had. Neither the possibility of Elaine Trakand taking the throne nor Dobrain's new title had brought nearly as much consternation as the ridiculous and ridiculously persistent rumors about the Althor boy going to Tar Valon to submit to Elida, though she had done nothing to quell those. That tale had everyone from nobles to stablemen half afraid to breathe, which was very well and good for maintaining the peace. The game of houses had ground to a halt. Well, compared to how matters normally were in Kyrian. The Aiel who came into the city from their huge camp a few miles east very likely helped, however much they were hated by the general run of folk. Everyone knew they followed the Dragon Reborn, and no one wanted to risk finding themselves on the wrong end of thousands of Aiel's spears. Young Althor was much more useful absent than present. Rumors out of the west of Aiel raiding elsewhere, looting, burning, killing indiscriminately, so merchants' hearsay claimed, gave people another reason to step gingerly with those here. In fact, there seemed to be no burrs to prick Kyrian out of its quiet, aside from the occasional street brawl between four-gators and city folk, who considered the noisy, brightly clad four-gators as alien as the Aiel, and a good deal safer to fight. The city was crowded to the attics, with people sleeping anywhere they could find shelter from the cold. Yet food supplies were more than adequate, if not overabundant, and trade was actually better than expected in winter. All in all, she should have felt content that she was carrying out Cadswain's instructions as well as the Green could wish for, except that Cadswain would expect more. She always did. Are you listening to me, Samitsu? Sighing, Samitsu turned from the peaceful view through the window, taking pains not to smooth her yellow-slashed skirts. The jacunda-made silver bells in her hair tinkled faintly, but today the sound failed to soothe her. At the best of times, she did not feel entirely comfortable in her apartments in the palace, though a blazing fire in the wide marble fireplace gave a good warmth, and the bed in the next room had the best quality feather mattresses and goose-down pillows. All three of her rooms were overly ornate in the severe Kyrianan fashion, the white ceiling plaster worked in interlocking squares, the wide bar cornices heavily gilded, and the wooden wall panels polished to a soft glow, yet dark even so. The furnishings were darker still, and massively constructed, edged with thin lines of gold leaf and inlaid with patterned ivory wedges. The flowered Tyran carpet in this room seemed garishly disordered compared to everything else, and emphasized the surrounding stiffness. It all seemed too much like a cage of late. What really discomfited her, though, was the woman with her hair in ringlets to her shoulders, standing in the middle of the carpet, fists on her hips, a belligerent set to her chin, and a frown narrowing her blue eyes. Sachal wore the great serpent ring, of course, on her right hand, but also an Aiel necklace and bracelet, fat beads of silver and ivory intricately worked and carved, gaudy against her high-necked dress of brown wool, which was plain, if fine and well cut. Not crude pieces, certainly, but flamboyant, and hardly the sort a sister would wear. The oddity of that jewelry might hold the key to much, if Samitsu could ever find the reason behind it. The wise ones, especially Soralia, looked at her as if she were a fool for not knowing without asking, and refused to be bothered with answering. They did that all too often. Most especially Soralia. Samitsu was unused to being thought a fool, and she disliked it immensely. Not for the first time, she found it difficult to meet the other sister's gaze. Sachal was the major reason contentment eluded her, no matter how well everything was going otherwise. Most maddening, Sachal was a red, yet despite her Aja, she was oath-sworn to young Althor. How could any Aes Sedai swear fealty to anyone or anything other than the White Tower itself? How in the light could a red swear to a man who could channel? Maybe Varen had been right about Tavir and twisting chance. Samitsu could not begin to think of any other reason for 31 sisters, 5 of them red, to take such an oath. The Lady Ailiel has been approached by lords and ladies who represent most of House Riatan's strength, she replied, much more patiently than she felt. They want her to take the high seat of Riatan, and she wants White Tower approval. Aes Sedai approval, at least. For something to do besides match stares, and likely lose, she moved to a blackwood table where a gold-worked silver pitcher sitting on a silver tray still gave off the faint scent of spices. Filling a cup with mulled wine provided an excuse to break the fleeting eye contact. Needing an excuse made her replace the pitcher on the tray with a sharp clink. She found herself avoiding looking at Sachal too often. Even now she realized she was looking at the other woman sideways. To her frustration, she could not quite make herself turn completely to meet her stare. Tell her no, Sachal. Her brother was still alive when last seen, and rebellion against the Dragon Reborn is nothing that need concern the tower. Certainly not now it's done with. The memory arose of Toram Riatan as last seen, running off into a strange fog that could take on solid form and kill. A fog that resisted the one power. The shadow had walked outside the walls of Kyrian that day. Samitsu's voice tightened from the effort to stop it short of trembling, not with fear, but anger. That had been the day she failed at healing young Althor. She hated failures, hated remembering them, and she should not have to explain herself. Most of Riatan's strength is not all. Those still tied to Toram will oppose her, with force of arms if necessary, and in any case fostering upheaval inside the houses themselves is no way to maintain the peace. There is a precarious balance in Kyrian now, Sachal, but it is a balance, and we mustn't disturb it. She managed to stop short of saying Cadsuane would be displeased if they did. That would hardly carry weight with Sachal. Upheaval will come whether or not we foster it, the other sister said firmly. Her frown had faded as soon as Samitsu showed she had been listening, though the set of her jaw remained. Perhaps it was stubbornness rather than belligerence, yet that hardly mattered. The other woman was not arguing or trying to convince her, just stating her own position. And most galling of all, plainly doing that much as a courtesy. The Dragon Reborn is the herald of upheaval and change, Samitsu. The herald foretold. And if he weren't, this is Kyrian. Do you think they have really stopped playing at Des Demar? The surface of the water may be still, but the fish never stop swimming. A red, preaching the Dragon Reborn like a street-corner demagogue. Light. And if you are wrong? In spite of herself, Samitsu bit off the words. Sashal, burn her, maintained a perfect serenity. Ailil has forsworn any claim to the Sun Throne in favor of Elaine Trakand, which is what the Dragon Reborn desires, and she is ready to swear fealty to him if I ask it. Toran led an army against Rand al-Thor. I say the change is worth making and the chance worth taking, and I will tell her so. The bells in Samitsu's hair chimed at an irritated shake of her head, and she barely managed to stop herself from sighing again. 18 of those dragon-sworn sisters remained in Kyrian. Cadsuane had carried some away with her, then sent Alana back to take off still more, and others of the 18 besides Sashal stood higher than she, but the Aiel wise ones kept them out of her way. In principle, she disapproved of how that was done. Aes Sedai could not be apprentices, not to anyone. It was outrageous, but in practice it did make her job easier. They could not meddle or try to take charge with wise ones running their lives and watching over their every hour. Unfortunately, for some reason she could not learn, the wise ones looked differently on Sashal and the other 2 sisters who had been stilled at Dumai's wells. Stilled. She felt a faint shiver at the thought, but only faint, and it would be less if she ever managed to work out how Dahmer Flynn had healed what could not be healed. At least someone could heal stilling, even if it was a man. A man channeling. Light. How the horror of yesterday became merely the uneasiness of today, once you grew accustomed. She was sure that Cadsuane would have arranged matters with the wise ones before leaving, had she known about the difference with Sashala and Ergine and Ronila. At least, she thought she was sure. This was not the first time she had been pulled into one of the legendary Green's designs. Cadsuane could be more devious than a blue, schemes inside plots wrapped in stratagems and all hidden behind still others. Some were planned to fail in order to help others succeed, and only Cadsuane knew which were which. Not at all a comforting thought. In any case, those 3 sisters were free to come and go as they desired, do as they desired. And they certainly felt no need to follow the guidance Cadsuane had left behind, or to follow the sister she had named to lead. Only their mad oath to Althor guided or constrained them. Samitsu had never felt weak or ineffectual in her life, except when her talent failed her, yet she very much wished that Cadsuane would return and take matters out of her hands. A few words delivered in Ailil's ear would quench any desire the lady had to mount the high seat, of course, yet it would come to nothing unless she found some way to deflect Sashal from her purpose. No matter that Ailil feared having her silly secrets aired abroad. Inconsistency in what Aes Sedai told her could well make her decide it was better to try vanishing to her country estates rather than risk offending a sister, whatever she did. Cadsuane would be upset over losing Ailil. Samitsu herself would be upset. Ailil was a conduit into half the plots brewing among the nobles, a gauge to be sure those intrigues were all still petty and unlikely to bring any major disturbance. The cursed Red knew that. And once Sashal gave Ailil this permission, it would be her the woman came running to with her news, not Samitsu Tamagawa. While Samitsu was floundering in her quandary, the door to the hallway opened to admit a pale, stern-faced Kyrianan woman, a hand shorter than either Aes Sedai. Her hair was in a thick gray roll on the nape of her neck, and she wore an unadorned gray dress so dark it was nearly black, the current livery of a Sun Palace servant. Servants never announced themselves or asked admittance, of course, but Corgaida Maran Devon was hardly just another servant. The heavy, silvery ring of long keys at her waist was a badge of office. Whoever ruled Kyrian, the holder of the keys ruled the Sun Palace in simple fact, and there was nothing submissive in Corgaida's manner. She made a minimal curtsy, carefully aimed halfway between Samitsu and Sashal. "I was asked to report anything unusual," she said to the heir, though it had been Samitsu who asked. Very likely she had known of the power struggle between them as soon as they did themselves. Little in the palace escaped her. "I'm told there is an Ogier in the kitchens. He and a young man supposedly are looking after work as masons, but I have never heard of Ogier and human masons working together. And Stedding Sofu sent word no masons would be available from any steading for the foreseeable future when we inquired after the incident." The pause was barely perceptible, and her grave expression did not alter. But half the gossip about the attack on the Sun Palace laid it to Althor's doing, the other half to Aes Sedai. A few tales mentioned the Forsaken, but only to pair them with either Althor or the Aes Sedai. Pursing her lips in thought, Samitsu set aside the cursed tangle Karienen made of everything they touched. Denials of Aes Sedai involvement did little good. The 3 oaths went only so far, in a city where a simple yes or no could give rise to 6 contradictory rumors. But Ogier. The palace kitchens scarcely took in stray passers-by, yet the cooks very likely would give an Ogier a hot meal just for the strangeness of seeing him. Ogier were even more uncommon than usual this last year or so. A few were still seen now and then, but walking as fast as only an Ogier could, and seldom stopping in one place more than long enough to sleep. They rarely traveled with humans, much less worked with them. The pairing tickled something in her mind, though. Hoping to tease whatever it was into the open, she opened her mouth to ask a few questions. "Thank you, Corgaida," Sashal said with a smile. "You've been most helpful. But if you will leave us now." Being abrupt with the holder of the keys was a good way to find yourself with dirty bed linens and poorly spiced meals, unemptied chamber pots and messages that went astray, 1,000 annoyances that could make life a misery and leave you wading in mud trying to accomplish anything at all. Yet somehow that smile appeared to take the sting out of her words for Corgaida. The gray-haired woman bowed her head slightly in assent, and again made the smallest possible curtsy, this time obviously to Sashal. No sooner had the door closed behind the gray-haired woman than Samitsu thumped her silver cup back on the tray hard enough to splash warm wine over her wrist and rounded on the Red Sister. She was on the brink of losing control of Ailil, and now the Sun Palace itself appeared to be slipping through her fingers. It was as likely Corgaida would sprout wings and fly as keep silent about what she had seen here, and whatever she said would flash through the palace and infect every servant, down to the men who mucked out the stables. That final curtsy had made it quite clear what she thought. Liked, but Samitsu hated Kyrian. The customs of civility between sisters were deeply ingrained, but Sashal did not stand high enough to make her hold her tongue in the face of this disaster, and she intended to deliver the rough side of it. Frowning at the other woman, though, she saw Sashal's face, really saw it, perhaps for the first time, and suddenly she knew why it troubled her so, perhaps even why she had found it difficult to look directly at the Red Sister. It was no longer an Aes Sedai face, outside of time and standing apart from age. Most people were unsure of the look until it was pointed out, but it was unmistakable to another sister. Perhaps some bits remained, scraps that made Sashal appear closer to beautiful than she really was, yet anyone at all would put an age to her, somewhere short of her middle years. The realization froze Samitsu's tongue. What was known about women who had been stilled was little better than rumor. They ran away and hid from other sisters. Eventually they died. Usually they died soon rather than late. The loss of Saidar was more than most women could bear for very long. But it was all really tittle-tattle. As far as she knew, No one in a very long time had had the nerve to try learning more. The rarely acknowledged fear in the darkest corner of every sister's head that the same fate might come to her one day in a careless moment kept anyone from wanting to know too much. Even Aes Sedai could hide their eyes when they did not want to see. There were always those rumors, though, almost never mentioned, and so vague you could never recall where you heard them first. Whispers on the edge of hearing, yet forever floating about. One that Samitsu had only half remembered till now said that a woman who was stilled grew young again, if she lived. It had always seemed ludicrous till now. Regaining the ability to channel had not given Sashal back everything. Once more she would have to work with the power for years to gain the face that would proclaim her Aes Sedai to any sister who could see her clearly. Or would she regain it? It seemed inevitable, yet this was unmapped terrain. And if her face was changed, was anything else about her changed as well? Samitsu shivered, harder than she had for the thought of stilling. Perhaps it was as well she had gone slow in trying to puzzle out Dahmer's way of healing. Fingering her Aiel necklace, Sashal seemed unaware that Samitsu had any grievance, unaware of Samitsu's scrutiny. This may be nothing, or it may warrant looking into, she said. But Clorgaida was only reporting what she heard. If we want to learn anything, we must go and see for ourselves. Without another word, she gathered her skirts and started out of the apartments, leaving Samitsu only a choice between following or remaining behind. It was intolerable, yet remaining was unthinkable. Sashal was no taller than she, not to speak of, but she had to hurry to keep up as the red glided swiftly along wide, square-vaulted corridors. Taking the lead was out of the question unless she chose to run. She fumed in silence, although it required gritting her teeth. Arguing with another sister in public was improper at best. Worse, without any doubt, it would be futile, and that would only dig the hole she was in deeper. She felt a very great desire to kick something. Stand lamps at regular intervals gave plenty of light, even in the darkest stretches of hallway, but there was little color or decoration beyond the occasional tapestry, with everything in it arranged in orderly fashion, whether animals being hunted or nobles fighting gallantly in battle. A few niches in the walls held ornaments of gold or seafolk porcelain, and in some corridors the cornices were worked in friezes, most left unpainted. That was all. Cairhienin hid their opulence out of public view, as they did with so much. The serving men and women who hurried industriously along the halls like streams of ants wore livery the color of charcoal, except for those in service to nobles resident in the palace, who seemed bright beside the rest, with their house badges embroidered on their breasts, and their collars and sometimes sleeves marked in house colors. One or two even had a coat or dress all in house colors, and appeared almost an outlander among the others. But they all kept their eyes down and barely paused long enough to offer quick bows or curtsies to the two sisters as they passed. The Sun Palace required countless hundreds of servants, and it seemed they were all scurrying about this morning, tending their chores. Nobles strolled in the hallways too, offering their own cautious courtesies to the Aes Sedai as they passed, perhaps with a greeting carefully balanced between an illusion of equality and the true state of affairs, spoken in low voices that did not carry far. They proved the old saying that strange times make for strange traveling companions. Old enmities had been put away in the face of new dangers, for the moment. Here, 2 or 3 pale Cairhienin lords in dark silk coats with thin stripes of color across the front, some with the fronts of their heads shaved and powdered soldier fashion, promenaded alongside an equal number of dark Tyrans, taller in their bright coats with fat striped sleeves. There, a Tyran noblewoman in a snug pearl-sewn cap, colorfully brocaded gown, and pale lace ruff, walked arm in arm beside a shorter Cairhienin noble, with her hair in an elaborate tower that reached well above her companion's head, smoky gray lace under her chin, and narrow stripes of her house colors cascading down the front of her wide-skirted dark silk, all like bosom friends and trusted confidants. Some pairings did look odder than others. A number of women had begun wearing outlandish clothes of late, apparently never noticing how they drew men's eyes and made even the servants struggle not to stare. Tight breeches and a coat barely long enough to cover the hips were not suitable garments for a woman, no matter how much effort went into rich embroidery or patterning the coat with gemstones. Jeweled necklaces and bracelets and pins with sprays of colorful feathers only pointed up the oddity, and those brightly dyed boots, with their heels that added as much as a hand to a woman's height, made them appear in danger of falling down with every swaying step. Scandalous, Sachal muttered, eyeing one such pair of women and twitching her skirts in displeasure. Scandalous, Samitsu murmured before she could stop herself, then snapped her mouth shut so hard her teeth clicked. She needed to control her tongue. Voicing agreement just because she agreed was a habit she could ill afford with Sachal. Still, she could not help glancing back at the pair in disapproval and a bit of wonder. A year ago, Alina Truliandred and Fionda Anares would have been at each other's throats, or rather have had their armsmen at one another's throats. But then who would have expected to see Bertoma Saigon walking peacefully with Weramon Saniago, neither man reaching for the dagger at his belt? Strange times and strange traveling companions. Doubtless they were playing the game of houses, maneuvering for advantage as they always had, yet dividing lines that once were graven in stone now turned out to have been drawn on water instead. Very strange times. The kitchens were on the lowest level of the Sun Palace above ground, at the back, a cluster of stone-walled, beamed-ceiling rooms centered around a long windowless room full of iron stoves and brick ovens and dressed stone fireplaces, and the heat was enough to make anyone forget the snow outside, or even that it was winter. Normally sweaty-faced cooks and undercooks, as darkly clad as any other palace servants beneath their white aprons, would have been scurrying about getting ready to prepare the midday meal, kneading loaves on long flower-strewn tables topped with marble, basting the joints and fowl that were turning on spits in the fireplaces. Now only the trotting spit dogs were moving, eager to earn their bits from the joints. Baskets of turnips and carrots stood unpeeled and unchopped, and smells sweet and spicy came from untended pots of sauces. Even the scullions, boys and girls surreptitiously wiping their faces on their aprons, stood on the fringe of a group of women clustered around one of the tables. From the doorway, Samitsu could see the back of an ogier's head rising above them where he was seated at the table, taller than most men would have been standing up, and broad with it. Of course, Kyrianen were short by and large, and that helped. She laid a hand on Sachal's arm, and for a wonder the woman stopped where they were without protest. Vanished without leaving a clue where he was going, the Ogier was asking in a deep rumble like the earth shifting. His long tufted ears, sticking up through dark hair that hung to his high collar, flicked back and forth uneasily. "Oh, do stop talking about him, Master Ladar," a woman's voice answered in a quaver that seemed well practiced. "Wicked he was. Tore half the palace apart with the one power he did. He could turn your blood to ice just looking at you and kill you as soon as look. Thousands have died by his own hand. Tens of thousands. Oh, I never liked talking about him." "For someone as never likes talking about something, Eldred Nethin," another woman said sharply. "You surely talk of little else." Stout and quite tall for a Kyrianen, nearly as tall as Samitsu herself, with a few strands of grey hair escaping her white plain-lace cap, she must have been the chief cook on duty, because everyone Samitsu could see quickly nodded agreement and twittered with laughter and said, "Oh, right you are, Mistress Beldair," in a particularly sycophantic way. Servants had their own hierarchies, as rigidly maintained as the tower itself. "But that sort of thing really is not for us to be gossiping over, Master Ladar," the stout woman went on. Aes Sedai business, that is, and not for the likes of you and me. Tell us more about the borderlands. Have you really seen Trollocs? Aes Sedai, a man muttered. Hidden by the crowd around the table, he had to be Ladar's companion. Samitsu could see no grown men among the kitchen folk this morning. Tell me, do you really think they bonded those men you were talking about? Those Ashaman, as warders? And what about the one who died? You never said how. Why, it was the Dragon Reborn as killed him, Eldred piped up. And what else would Aes Sedai bond a man as? Oh, terrible they was, them Ashaman. Turn you to stone with a look they could. You can tell one just by looking at him, you know. Frightful, glowing eyes they have. Be quiet, Eldred, Mistress Beldair said firmly. Maybe they was Ashaman and maybe not, Master Underhill. Maybe they was bonded and maybe not. All I or anyone else can say is they was with him. The emphasis in her voice made plain who she was talking about. Eldred might consider Randall Thor fearful, but this woman did not want to so much as name him. And soon after he left, suddenly the Aes Sedai was telling them what to do, and they was doing it. Of course, any fool knows to do as an Aes Sedai says. Anyway, those fellers are all gone off now. Why are you so interested in them, Master Underhill? Is that an Andoran name? Ladar threw back his head and laughed, a booming sound that filled the room. His ears twitched violently. Oh, we want to know everything about the places we visit, Mistress Beldair. The borderlands, you say? You might think it's cold here, but we've seen trees crack open like nuts on the floor from the cold in the borderlands. You have blocks of ice in the river floating down from upstream, but we've seen rivers as wide as the Alguenya frozen so merchants can drive loaded trains of wagons across them, and men fishing through holes cut in ice nearly a span thick. At night there are sheets of light in the sky that seem to crackle, bright enough to dim the stars, and even Mistress Beldair was leaning toward the Ogier, caught up. But one of the young scullions, too short to see past the adults, glanced behind him, and his eyes went wide when they lit on Samitsu and Sashal. His gaze stayed fixed on them as if trapped, but he fumbled with one hand till he could tug at Mistress Beldair's sleeve. The first time she shook him off without looking around. At a second tug, she turned her head with a scowl that vanished in a blink when she, too, saw the Aes Sedai. Grace favor you, Aes Sedai, she said, hastily tucking stray hair back under her cap as she bobbed her curtsy. How may I serve you? Ladar broke off short in mid-sentence, and his ears stiffened for a moment. He did not look toward the doorway. We wish to speak with your visitors, Sashal said, moving into the kitchen. We won't disrupt your kitchen for long. Of course, Aes Sedai. If the stout woman felt any surprise at two sisters wanting to talk to kitchen visitors, she showed none. Head swinging from side to side to take in everyone, she clapped her plump hands and began spouting orders. Eldred, those turnips will never peel themselves. Who was watching the fig sauce? Dried figs are hard to come by. Where is your basting spoon, Casey? Andil, run, fetch some. Cooks and scullions scattered in every direction, and a clatter of pots and spoons quickly filled the kitchen, though everyone was plainly making an effort to be as quiet as possible so as not to disturb the Aes Sedai. They were plainly making an effort not to even look in their direction, though that involved some contortion. The Ogier rose to his feet smoothly, his head coming near the thick ceiling beams. His clothing was what Samitsu remembered from meeting Ogier before, a long dark coat that flared over turned-down boots. Stains on his coat said he had been traveling hard. Ogier were a fastidious people. He only half turned to face her and Sashal, even as he made a bow, and he rubbed at his wide nose as if it itched, partially hiding his broad face, but he appeared young for an Ogier. Forgive us, Aes Sedai, he murmured, but we really must be moving on. bending to gather a huge leather scrip that had a large rolled blanket tied across the top and showed the impressions of several square shapes packed around whatever else was stuffed inside. He hoisted the broad strap over one shoulder. His capacious coat pockets bulged with angular shapes, too.
We have a long way to go before nightfall.
His companion remained seated, though, his hands spread on the tabletop. A pale-haired young man with a week's growth of beard who seemed to have slept more than one night in his rumpled brown coat. He watched the Aes Sedai warily, with dark eyes that belonged on a cornered fox. Where are you going that you can reach by nightfall? Sashal did not stop until she was standing in front of the young Ogier, close enough to need to crane her neck to look up at him, though she made it seem graceful rather than awkward, as it should have been. Are you on your way to the meeting we've heard about? In Stedding Shangtai? Master Ladar, is it? His tall ears twitched violently, then were still, and his teacup-sized eyes narrowed almost as warily as the young man's, till the dangling ends of his eyebrows trailed onto his cheeks.
Ladar, son of Shandin, son of Kormal, Aes Sedai,
he said reluctantly.
but I'm certainly not going to the Great Stump. Why the elders wouldn't let me close enough to hear what was being said.
He gave a deep bass chuckle that sounded forced.
We can't get where we're going tonight, Aes Sedai, but every league behind us is a league we don't have to walk tomorrow. We need to be on our way.
The unshaven young man stood up, running a hand nervously along the long hilt of the sword belted at his waist, yet he made no move to pick up the scrip and blanket roll at his feet and follow as the Ogier started toward the door that led to the street, even when the Ogier said over his shoulder,
We need to go now, Carlden.
Sashal glided fluidly into the Ogier's path, though she had to take 3 strides to his 1. You were asking after work as a mason, Master Ladar, she said in tones brooking no nonsense. But your hands are not as calloused as any masons I've ever seen. It would be best for you to answer my questions. Suppressing a triumphant smile, Samitsu moved up beside the Red Sister. So, Sashal thought she could simply push her aside and ferret out what was going on, did she? The woman was in for a surprise. You really must stay away, she said to the Ogier in a loud voice. The noise was close enough to keep anyone from overhearing, yet there was no need to take chances. When I came to the Sun Palace, I had already heard of a young Ogier, a friend of Randall. He left Calian in company with a young man named Carlton. Isn't that right, Loyal? The Ogier's ears wilted. The young man bit off a coarse curse he should have known better than to mouth in front of sisters. I leave when I want to leave, Aes Sedai, he said harshly, but in a low voice. For the most part, he divided his gaze between her and Sashal, yet he was watchful for any of the cameras. He did not wish to be overheard either. Before I do, I want some answers. What happened to my friends? And him? Did he go mad? Loyal sighed heavily and made a pacifying gesture with one huge hand.
Be easy, Carlden,
he murmured.
Rand wouldn't like you starting trouble. Be easy.
Carlden's scowl only deepened. Abruptly it occurred to Samitsu that she could have handled this better. Those were not the eyes of a cornered fox, but a wolf. She had grown too accustomed to Dahmer and Jahar and Aben, safely bonded and tamed. That might be an overstatement, though Maurice was making an effort with Jahar. That was Maurice's way. Yet it seemed the horror of yesterday could become the complacency of today, after long enough exposure. Carlden Manfor was an Ashaman, too, and neither bonded nor tamed. Was he embracing the male half of the power? She almost laughed. Did birds fly? Sachal was watching the young man with a studying frown, her hands much too still on her skirts. But Samitsu was glad not to see the light of Saidar around her. Ashaman could feel it when a woman held the power, and that might make him act precipitately. Certainly she and Samitsu together could handle him. Could they, if he already held the power? Of course they could. Of course. But it would be much better if they did not have to. Sachal certainly was making no move to take charge now, so Samitsu laid a hand lightly on his left arm. Through his coat sleeve it felt like a bar of iron. So he was as uneasy as she. As uneasy as she? Light. But Dahmer and those other two had spoiled all her instincts. He seemed sane as most men when I last saw him, she said softly, with just a slight emphasis. None of the kitchen folk were nearby, but a few had begun sneaking peeks toward the table. Loyal exhaled heavily in relief, a sound like water crashing across the edge of the cave, but she kept her attention on Carlden. I don't know where he is, but he was alive as of a few days ago. Alana had been close-mouthed as a mussel beyond that, and overbearing, too, with Catswain's note in her fist. Fedwin Moore died of poison, I fear, but I have no idea who gave it to him. To her surprise, Carlden merely shook his head with a rueful grimace and muttered something incomprehensible about wine. As for the others, they became warders of their own free will. Her Roshan certainly had not wanted to be a warder until she decided she wanted him for one. Even a woman who was not Aes Sedai could usually make a man decide the way she wanted. They thought it a better choice, safer than returning to the others like you. You see, the damage here was done with Saidin. You understand who must have been behind it? It was an attempt to kill the one whose sanity you fear for. That did not seem to surprise him either. What sort of men were these, Ashaman? Was their so-called Black Tower a murder pit? The tightness went out of his arm, though, and suddenly he was just a road-weary young man who needed to shave. Light, he breathed. What do we do now, Loyal? Where do we go? I don't know, Loyal replied, his shoulders sagging tiredly and his long ears drooping. We have to find him, Carlden. Somehow. We can't give up now. We have to let him know we did what he asked, as much as we could. And what was it Althor had asked, Samitsu wondered. With a little luck, she could learn a great deal from these two. A tired man, or Ogier, feeling lost and alone, was ripe for answering questions. Carlden gave a small jump, his hand tightening on his sword hilt, and she bit back a curse of her own as a palace serving woman came running into the room with her staff almost to her knees. Lord Dobrain's been murdered, the serving woman squealed. We will all be killed in our beds. My own eyes have seen the dead walking old Marangil himself, and my man says spirits will kill you if there has been a murder done. Her mouth froze open when she caught the presence of Aes Sedai, and she skidded to a halt, still clutching her skirts. The kitchen folk seemed frozen too, all watching the Aes Sedai from the corners of their eyes to see what they would do. Not Dobrain, Loyal moaned, ears laying flat against his head. Not him. He looked as much angry as saddened, his face stony. Samitsu did not think she had ever seen an Ogier angry. What is your name? Sachal demanded of the serving woman, before Samitsu could even part her lips. How do you know he was murdered? How do you even know he's dead? The woman swallowed, her eyes held by Sachal's cool gaze. Sarah, Aes Sedai, she said hesitantly, bending her knees in a curtsy and only then realizing that she still had her skirts gathered up. Hastily smoothing them down only seemed to fluster her more. Sarah Doinal? They say... Everybody says Lord Dobrain is... swallowed again, hard. They all say his rooms are covered with blood. He was found lying in a great pool of it, with his head cut off, they say. They say a great many things, Sashal said grimly, and usually they're wrong. Zamitsu, you will come with me. If Lord Dobrain has been injured, you may be able to do something for him. Loyal, Carlton, you come too. I don't want you out of my sight before I have a chance to ask a few questions. Burn your questions, the young Ashaman growled, shouldering his belongings. I'm leaving.
No, Carlton,
Loyal said gently, laying a huge hand on his companion's shoulder.
we can't go before we know about Dobrain. He's a friend, Rand's friend, and mine. We can't. Anyway, where are we hurrying to?
Carlton looked away. He had no answer. Samitsu squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath, but there was no help for it. She found herself following Sashal out of the kitchens, once more hurrying to keep up with the other woman's quick, gliding stride. In fact, she found herself half running. Sashal set an even more rapid pace than before. The babbling of voices rose behind them as soon as they were out the door. The kitchen folk probably all were pressing the serving woman for particulars, details she very likely would invent where her knowledge failed. 10 different versions of events would find their way out of that kitchen, if not as many as there were kitchen folk. Worst of all, 10 different versions of events in the kitchen would find their way out, everyone adding to the rumors Korgaida doubtless was already starting. She could hardly recall a day that had gone so badly for her so suddenly, like slipping on one patch of ice only to find another under her feet, then another. Cadswain would have her hide to make gloves after this. At least Loyal and Carlton trailed after Sashal as well. Whatever she learned from them might still be put to advantage, a way to salvage something. Scurrying along at Sashal's side, she studied them in brief glances over her shoulder. Taking short strides to keep from overrunning the Aes Sedai, the Ogier was frowning in worry. Over Dobrain, very likely, but also perhaps over only completing his mysterious task as well as he could. That was a mystery she intended to solve. The young Ashaman had no difficulty keeping up, though he wore an expression of stubborn reluctance and his hand caressed his sword hilt. The danger in him did not lie in steel. He stared suspiciously at the backs of the Aes Sedai head, once meeting Samitsu's glance with a dark glower. He had the sense to keep his mouth shut, though. She would have to find a way to pry it open later for more than snarling. Sashal never glanced behind to make sure the pair were following, but then she had to hear the thud of the Ogier's boots on the floor tiles. Her face was thoughtful, and Samitsu would have given a great deal to know what she was thinking. Sashal might be oath-sworn to Randall Thor, but what protection did that give to an Ashaman? She was red, after all. That had not changed with her face. Light. This could be the worst patch of ice of all. It was a long, arduous climb from the kitchens to Lord Dobrain's apartments in the Tower of the Full Moon, which was usually set aside for visiting nobility of high rank. And all along the way, Samitsu saw the evidence that Sarah had been far from the first to hear what the ever-anonymous they had to say. Rather than endless streams of servants flowing along the corridors, small, excited knots stood whispering anxiously. At sight of the Aes Sedai, they sprang apart and scurried away. A handful did think at seeing an Ogier striding through the palace, yet for the most part they all but fled. The nobles who had been about before had all vanished, doubtless back to their own rooms, to mull over what opportunities and hazards Dobrain's death afforded them. Whatever Sashal thought, Samitsu no longer doubted. If Dobrain had been alive, his own servants would have put paid to the rumor already. For further confirmation, the hallway outside Dobrain's rooms was crowded with ashen-faced servants, their sleeves ringed to the elbows in the blue and white of House Taborwin. Some wept, and others looked lost, their foundation stone pulled out from under them. At a word from Sashal, they stood aside for the Aes Sedai, moving drunkenly or mechanically. Dazed eyes swept by the ogier without actually registering what they saw. Few remembered to make even half-hearted curtsies. Inside, the anteroom was almost as full of hovering servants, most staring as if Dobrain himself lay motionless on a litter in the middle of the large room, his head still attached to his body, but his eyes closed, and a drying sheet of blood from a long cut in his scalp across his still features. A dark trickle had leaked from his slack mouth. Two serving men with tears streaming down their cheeks paused in the act of laying a white cloth over his face at the entrance of the Aes Sedai. Dobrain did not appear to be breathing, and there were blood-stained gashes in the chest of his coat, with its thin stripes of color that marched down to his knees. Beside the litter, a dark blot larger than a man's body marred the green and yellow Tyran maze of the fringed carpet. Anyone who lost that much blood had to be dead. Two other men lay sprawled on the floor, one with death-glazed eyes gazing at the ceiling, the other on his side, an ivory knife hilt sticking up from his ribs where the blade had surely reached his heart. Short, pale-skinned Kyrianan both wore the livery of palace servants, but a servant never carried the long wooden-handled dagger that lay beside each corpse. A House Taborwin man, his foot drawn back to kick one of the corpses, hesitated on seeing the two sisters, then planted his boot hard in the dead man's ribs anyway. Clearly, Papa Decorum lay far from anyone's mind at the moment. "Move that cloth out of the way," Sashal told the men.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.